Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to discuss the late intrauterine fetal death and stillbirth guidelines. These are basically the RCOG guidelines which were published in 2010. So what is the purpose and the scope of these guidelines? It is basically to identify the evidence-based options for the women and the relatives who have a late intrauterine fetal death and after 24 complete week of the pregnancy of a singleton fetus. It is basically to incorporate the information on the general care before, during, and after the and the care in the future pregnancies. The guidance is primarily intended for the obstetrician midwives and but also for the patients and their partners to help them and for the general practitioners and the commissioners of the healthcare. So what is the background of these guidelines? These are basically from the perinatal mortality surveillance report, which defines the stillbirth. It is a baby who delivered with no signs and symptoms after 24 weeks. And then what would be the intrauterine fetal death? It basically refers to the babies who have no signs of the life in utero. Now let's see what are the optimal methods for the diagnosis of the late intrauterine fetal death. It is the auscultation and cardiotocography. They should not be the use for the investigating the the suspected IUFD. And real-time ultrasonography, it is essential for the accurate diagnosis. Ideally the real-time ultrasonography, they should be available in all times. A second opinion, they should be obtained whenever practically possible. And mothers, they should be prepared for the possibility of passive fetal movements. If the mother reports the passive fetal movements, then you should look for the another repeat scan. And auscultation of the fetal heart by the Pinard stethoscope or the Doppler ultrasonography is insufficiently accurate for the diagnosis. Auscultation can also give the false reassurance. The maternal pelvic blood flow, they can result in an apparently normal fetal heart rate pattern with the external Doppler. Real-time ultrasonography, they allows the direct visualization of the heart, fetal heart, and imaging they can technically be difficult, particularly in the presence of the maternal obesity, the abdominal scars, or the oligohydramnios, but use they can often be augmented with the color Doppler of the fetal heart and the umbilical cord. In addition to the absence of the fetal cardiac activity, other secondary features, they might be seen the collapse of a fetal skull with the overlapping bones, the high drops, the maceration resulting in the unrecognizable fetal mass, and the intrafetal gas, which is within the heart, blood vessels, and the joints, is another features associated with the IUFD. That skin edema, they can be discussed with the parents. Although the evidence of the occult placental abruption, they might also be identified. The sensitivity, they can be as low as 15%, and even large abruptions, they can be missed. Now what is the best practice for discussing the diagnosis of the suspected cases? If the woman is unaccompanied, an immediate offer they should be made to call her partner, relative, or the friend, whatever she wants. So now what should be the investigations for the cause of the late intrauterine fetal death? The general principle of investigation, what is it? It is basically the clinical assessment and laboratory tests, they should be recommended to assess the maternal well-being, including coagulopathy, and to determine the cause of the death, the chance of recurrence, and the possible means of the avoiding the future pregnancy complications. The parents, they should be advised that no specific cause is found in almost half of the stillbirth. The parents, they should be advised that when a cause is found, it can crucially influence the care in a future pregnancy. Care, they should be aware that an abnormal test result is not necessarily related to the IUFD. Correlations between the blood test and the postmortem examination, they should be sought. Further tests, they might be indicated following the result of the postmortem examination. Systems that use the customized space chart and they capture the multiple contributing factors, they should be used to categorize the late IUFDs. There is also a moderate risk of the maternal disseminated intravascular coagulation, 10% within 4 weeks after the date of the late IUFD, and rising to 30% thereafter. This can be tested by clotting studies, the blood platelets counts, and the fibrinogen measurements. Tests, they should be repeated twice weekly in the women who choose the expectant management. Now moving, are there any special recommendations for the women with an IUFD who are rhesus D negative? Sorry for this blur appearance of the data. And women who are rhesus D, D negative, they should be advised to have a Kleihor test undertaking urgently to detect the large fetal-maternal hemorrhage that might have occurred a few days earlier. Anti-RH, anti-D gamma globulins, they should be administered as soon as possible after the presentation. If it is important to know the baby's blood group, if no blood sample they can be obtained from the baby or the cord, RHD typing they should be undertaking using the free fetal DNA from the maternal blood taken shortly after the birth. In these women who are rhesus negative, the potentially sensitizing the bleeding might have occurred days before the death is recognized. Thereafter, the window of optimal timing of the anti-RHD gamma globulin administration, which is 72 hours, 24 anti RHD gamma globulins provides reduced benefits when given beyond 72 hours up to the 10 days after the sensitizing events. Now, moving towards the test which is recommended for the women with the late IUFTs. Sorry for these blur data. Test number 1 is the maternal standards hematology and biochemistry, including the CRPs and the bile salts. Test number 2 is the maternal coagulation times and the plasma fibrinogen, which is DIC. It will recognize the DIC. Number third is which we just discussed. It is the Kleihor. It is for the lethal fetal-maternal hemorrhage. You should also know the reasons why we are doing these tests. But the tests are maternal bacteriology, which is through the blood culture, midstream urine, the vaginal swabs, the cervical swabs. Then maternal serology for the viral screening, syphilis, and the tropical infections. For the maternal random blood glucose levels, and maternal HbA1c, and maternal thyroid functions, maternal thrombophilia screen, anti red cell antibody serology, maternal anti-RO and anti-LA antibodies, maternal alloimmune antiplatelet antibodies. The parenteral blood for the karyotype, maternal urine for the cocaine metabolites, fetal and placental microbiology for fetal blood, fetal swab, placental swab, fetal and placental tissue for the karyotype and the possible single gene testing, deep fetal skin, the fetal cartilage, placenta, and postmortem examination, external autopsy, microscopy, x-rays, and placenta and cord. So, what precautions they should be taken when sexing the baby? Parents, they can be advised before the birth about the potential difficulty in sexing the baby when appropriate. Two experienced healthcare practitioners, midwives, obstetricians, and neonatologists or pathologists, they should inspect the baby when examining the external genital of extremely preterm, severely macerated, or the gross hydropic infants. If there is any difficulty or the doubt, rapid karyotyping they should be offered using the quantitative fluorescent polymerase chain reaction or the fluorescence in situ hybridization for the sexing the baby. Now, what is the guidance on the perinatal post-mortem examination for the maternity clinicians? Parents, they should be offered full postmortem examination to help explain the cause of the IUFT. Patients or the parents, they should be advised the postmortem examination. They provide more information than other less invasive tests and then can sometimes be crucial to management of the future pregnancy. Attempts to persuade the parents to choose the postmortem, they must be avoided. Individual cultural and religious beliefs, they must be suspected. Written consents, they must be taken for any invasive procedures on the baby, including the tissue taken for the genetic analysis. Consent, they should be sought or directly supervised by an obstetrician or the midwife trained in special consent issue and the nature of the perinatal postmortem, including the retention of any tissue for the clinical investigation, research, and teaching. Parents, they should be offered a description of what happens during the procedure and the likely appearance of the baby afterward. They should include the information on how the baby is treated with the dignity and any arrangement for transport. Discussion, they should be supplemented by the offer of a leaflet. Postmortem examination, they should include the external examination with the birth weight, histology of the relevant tissue and the skeletal x-rays. Pathological examination of the cord, the membranes and the placenta, they should be recommended whether or not post-mortem examination of the baby is requested. The examination, they should be undertaken by a specialist perinatal pathologist. Parents who decline full post-mortem might be offered a limited examination, thus sparing certain organs, but this is not straightforward and they should be discussed with a perinatal pathologist before being offered. Less invasive methods such as the needle biopsies, they can be offered, but they are the much less informative and reliable than the conventional postmortem. Ultrasonography and the magnetic resonance imaging, they should not yet be offered as a substitute for the conventional postmortem. MRI can be used or it is a useful adjunct to conventional postmortem. Now, what about the labor and birth? What are the recommendations for the timing and the mode of the birth? Recommendations about the labor and the birth, they should take into account the mother's preference as well as her medical condition and the previous intrapartum history. Women, they should be strongly advised to have immediate step towards the delivery if it is sepsis, the preeclampsia, placental abruption or the membrane rupture, but a more flexible approach, they can be discussed if these factors are not present. Well, women with the intact membranes and no laboratory evidence of the DIC, they should be advised that they are unlikely to come to the physical harm if they delay the labor for a short period, but they may develop the severe medical complications and suffer the greater anxiety with the prolonged intervals. Women who delay labor for medical complications suffer greater anxiety with the prolonged intervals. Women who delay labor for periods longer than 48 hours, they should be advised to have the testing for the DIC twice weekly. If the woman they return home before the labor, she should be given a 24-hour contact number for information and support. Women they contemplating prolonged expectant management, they should be advised that the value of postmortem they may be reduced. And women contemplating prolonged expectant management, they should be advised that the appearance of the baby may deteriorate. Vaginal birth is the recommended mode of delivery for most women, but cesarean delivery they will be needed to consider with some. More than 5% of the women with the IUFD deliver spontaneously within 3 weeks of the diagnosis. If the woman is physically well, her membranes are intact, and there is no evidence of the preeclampsia, infection, or bleeding, the risk of the expectant management for the 48 hours is low. There is a 10% chance of maternal DIC within 4 weeks from the date of the fetal death, and an increasing thereafter. Now, how should labor be induced for a woman with an unscarred uterus? A combination of mifepristone and the prostaglandin preparation, they should usually be recommended as the first line intervention for the induction of labor. Misoprostol can be used in preference to the prostaglandin E2 because of the equivalent safety and efficacy with lower cost but at doses lower than those currently marked in the UK. Women they should be advised that the vaginal misoprostol is an effective as oral therapy but associated with the fever adverse effects. The use of the misoprostol for induction of the labor in the women with the IUFD, they have been endorsed by the NICE. NICE recommended that the choice and the dose of the vaginal NICE recommended that the choice and dose of the vaginal prostaglandins, they should take into account the clinical circumstances, availability of preparation, and local protocols. A review of misoprostol used for the late IUFDs recommended that the dose they should be adjusted according to the gestational age. 100 microgram 6 hourly before 26 plus 6 weeks, 25 to 50 microgram 4 hourly at 27 weeks or more up to 24 hours. A discussion of the safety and benefits of the induction of labor, they should be undertaken by a consultant obstetrician. Mifepristone, they can be used along to increase the chances of the labor significantly within 72 hours, avoiding the use of the prostaglandins. The mechanical method for the induction of the labor in the woman with the IUFD, they should be used only in the context of a clinical trial. Women with a single lower segment scar, they should be advised that in general, induction of labor with the prostaglandin is safe but not without the risk. Misoprostol, they can be safely used for the induction of labor in the woman with a single previous lower segment cesarean section and IUFD, but with the lower doses than that of the marked in the UK. Women with the two previous lower segment cesarean section, they should be advised that in general, the absolute risk of induction of labor with the prostaglandins is only a little higher than for the women in the single previous lower segment cesarean section. Women with more than two lower segment cesarean section, they deliver a atypical scar, they should be advised that the safety of the induction of labor is unknown. A transcervical balloon catheter technique, they was used to induce the labor for a small series of 37 weeks with a live fetus and the unfavorable cervix who has previously undergone a cesarean section. There was no complication and 79% achieved the birth. What are considered suitable facilities for the labor? Women, they should be advised to the labor in an environment that provide the appropriate facilities for the emergency cesarean section. Maternity units, they should aim to develop a special labor wardroom for the well women with an otherwise uncomplicated IUFDs and pay special head to the emotional and practical need without the compromising the safety. This can include a double bed for her partner or the other companion to share. What are the recommendations for the intrapartum antimicrobial therapy? Women with the sepsis, they should be treated with an intravenous broad spectrum antibiotic therapy, and routine antibiotic prophylaxis, they should not be used. Intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis for the women they colonized with the group B streptococcus is not indicated. Now, are there any special recommendation for the pain relief in the labor? Diamorphine, they should be used in the preference to the pethidine. Regional anesthesia, they should be available for the woman with IUFD, and assessment of for the DIC and sepsis, they should be taken before administration of regional anesthesia. Women, they should be offered an opportunity to meet with an obstetrical anesthetist. So what are the recommendations for the woman laboring with the scarred uterus? Women undergoing VBAC, they should be closely monitored for the features of the scar rupture. Augmentation, they can be used for the VBAC, but the decision, they should be made by the consultant obstetrician. Fetal heart rate abnormality, and usually the most common early sign of the scar dehiscence, does not apply in the circumstances. Other clinical features includes the maternal tachycardia, atypical pain, vaginal bleeding, hematuria and on the catheter specimen, and the maternal collapse.